Hello dear friends, welcome to my channel. Today I am going to share with you a very surprising truth, a story hidden in the folds of time, a story that still echoes in the walls of Delhi and in the memory of history. This is not just a tale about kings and emperors, not just about ceremonies and crowns, but about the giants of the earth, the elephants who bowed to kings in a way the world had never seen before. Before we begin, make sure to hit the subscribe button and press the bell icon so you never miss any interesting story from history that I bring for you. Now, let us go back in time to the year 1903. Delhi was not the crowded, restless city that you know today. It was a jewel of history, a place where Mughal emperors had once ruled, where Shah Jahan had built his Red Fort and Chandni Chowk, where centuries of rulers had left their mark in stone, marble, and dust. But in 1903, the city was transformed once again. Lord Curzon, the Viceroy of India, had decided that this city would host one of the grandest spectacles the world had ever seen, the Delhi Durbar. The occasion was to celebrate King Edward VII being proclaimed Emperor of India. This Durbar was no ordinary event. It was not simply a gathering of rulers and lords. It was an exhibition of power, of grandeur, of control. And at the center of it all were not soldiers with rifles, nor cannons, nor the glittering robes of kings, but the majestic elephants of India, painted, adorned, and dressed as if they themselves were monarchs. Imagine Delhi in those days, the streets buzzing with preparations, tents rising like palaces in the open fields, chandeliers arriving from Europe, carpets being unrolled from Persia, and jewels being polished to shine under the winter sun. But more than this, imagine the sound that carried across the city, the heavy footsteps of elephants. Every morning, at the break of dawn, mahouts could be seen bathing these giants in the Yamuna River, scrubbing their massive bodies, polishing their tusks with oil, and whispering to them words of comfort as if preparing a friend for battle. But this was not a battle. This was a theatre. The elephants were the stage, the living mountains upon which the princes of India would display their loyalty to the British crown. For weeks, painters and artisans worked on their bodies, covering them in bright colors: red, blue, green, and gold. Their ears were painted with sacred patterns, their foreheads adorned with symbols of prosperity, their trunks decorated with spirals and stars. When the sun touched them, they glowed like walking mosaics, living canvases of art and tradition. On their backs were placed howdahs, great seats made of wood, silver, and sometimes even gold. These were not simple chairs. They were miniature palaces, lined with velvet cushions, covered with silk canopies, and sometimes inlaid with precious stones. Each elephant carried a different design, and each design spoke of the wealth and heritage of the king or nobleman who rode upon it. Lord Curzon had envisioned this as the climax of the Durbar. He wanted the world to see not just British rule, but India itself, clothed in its finest colors, bowing before the crown. He wanted to show that even the most powerful creatures of this land, the elephants who had once marched into battles for Mughal emperors and Hindu kings, were now marching in celebration of British authority. The rehearsals began days before the Durbar. The fields outside the city turned into camps, where over 300 elephants gathered. The ground shook beneath their weight, their trumpets filled the air, and their shadows stretched across the land like moving fortresses. Villagers and townsfolk came from far and wide just to watch. Children squealed with delight when they saw a line of elephants walking in rhythm, their bodies painted with brilliant designs. Women whispered prayers, for in Indian tradition, the elephant was not just an animal, it was sacred, the very form of Lord Ganesha, remover of obstacles, symbol of wisdom and fortune. And so, as the elephants were prepared for their grand march, Delhi itself seemed to transform. The Red Fort stood like a silent witness, remembering the days when emperors had ruled from its marble halls. The Jama Masjid looked down upon the city as if it too was curious to see how the foreigners had dressed its old companion, Delhi, in such bright clothes. The bazaars of Chandni Chowk were filled with excitement, people selling sweets, toys, and little models of elephants for children to take home. The night before the Durbar, the city hardly slept. Torches and lanterns burned across the camps. The mahouts stayed awake, feeding their elephants sugarcane, bananas, and sometimes even jaggery mixed with milk, a special treat to give the animals strength. They sang songs in low voices, songs that told of the bond between man and beast, of loyalty and friendship. For the mahouts, these elephants were not merely animals of the parade, they were brothers, companions who had carried them through jungles and rivers, who had worked with them in logging camps, and who now would carry the pride of an empire on their backs. And then came the morning of the Durbar. The air was cold with the chill of January, but the sun rose bright, casting a golden glow over the city. The sound of drums and trumpets filled the air. Soldiers lined the streets in their bright red uniforms, bayonets shining, boots polished until they reflected the sky. Nobles and maharajas gathered in their richest robes, jewels sparkling at their throats and wrists. And then, like the opening of a grand play, the elephants began to move. One by one, they entered the great field where the Durbar was to be held. The earth trembled as they walked. Each step was a reminder of their power, yet each movement was graceful, almost royal. Their painted bodies gleamed in the light, their tusks shining like ivory swords, their howdahs towering above the crowd. On their backs sat the princes of India, dressed in silks and turbans, nodding in respect to the viceroy and his guests. The people gasped. Never before had such a sight been seen. Never before had elephants been used not for war, not for labor, but for a display of beauty, loyalty, and submission. The elephants bowed their great heads as they passed the throne of Lord Curzon, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Some said the elephants seemed to understand, as if they too knew the role they were playing in history. It was as if nature itself had bowed before the crown, as if the giants of India had accepted a foreign king. But behind the glitter and the grandeur, there was another truth. Some in the crowd looked upon the elephants, not with joy but with sorrow. They remembered that these same creatures had once carried Indian kings into battle, had once stood as symbols of independence and strength. Now they were dressed in colors and bows, paraded before a foreign ruler. For some, the sight was beautiful; for others, it was painful. Yet no one could deny the power of the spectacle. The elephants of Delhi Durbar became legend. Travelers who had come from across the seas wrote of it in their journals. Photographers captured the images, and those photographs would travel the world, showing Europe and America the strange and marvelous sight of elephants bowing before a king in Delhi. That day, history was written not only in ink and paper, but in footsteps pressed into the soil of Delhi by the largest creatures to ever walk beside man. The morning sun climbed higher over Delhi, and as the first elephants passed into the great field of the Durbar, more followed, each one more splendid than the last. The crowd gasped again and again, for the designs painted upon their bodies were not simple decorations, but entire stories drawn upon living skin. One elephant bore the sun and the moon upon its forehead, a symbol of eternity. Another carried lotus flowers across its sides, each petal carefully brushed in pink and gold. Some elephants had patterns that echoed the weavings of Kashmiri shawls, while others displayed geometric designs that reminded one of Mughal domes and arches. To the people of India, these were not just decorations, but symbols that spoke of their gods and their culture and their history. Upon their backs, the nobles of India sat proudly. The Maharaja of Jaipur, in his saffron turban studded with emeralds, carried himself as though he were upon a throne, his face stern yet calm. The Nizam of Hyderabad, among the richest men of the world, rode upon an elephant whose howdah shimmered with silver. Each ruler had come not only to pay respect to the British crown, but to display his own magnificence before his peers. The Durbar was as much a competition among princes as it was a celebration for the empire. The British officers stood in their places, their red coats blazing in the sun, their medals clinking against their chests. Many of them had never seen such a sight in all their lives. They had read of India's wealth, of its animals, its jewels, its colors, but to see 300 elephants in procession, painted and adorned like gods of the jungle, was beyond imagination. Some whispered to each other in disbelief, others stared in silence, their mouths half open. The crowds that had gathered from Delhi and beyond pressed closer to catch a glimpse. peasants in simple dortis, merchants in turbans, women carrying their children on their shoulders, all of them stood in awe. For them, it was as if the pages of the Ramayana or the Mahabharata had come alive, as if the elephants of Indra's celestial army had descended to earth. They clapped, they shouted, they bowed, some even touched the ground in reverence as the elephants passed. The mahouts sat upon the necks of their elephants, guiding them with soft words and gentle nudges of the foot. They knew each animal's temperament. Some elephants were calm and steady, walking with grace. Others were restless, their trunks swinging, their ears flapping in irritation at the noise. But all of them moved with dignity, as though they understood that they were part of something greater than themselves. One mahout whispered to his beast, "Steady, Raja, steady," and the elephant lowered its head as it passed the throne, almost as if bowing before the emperor's name. Lord Curzon sat watching from his dais, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. This was his grand design, his vision of empire made real. He had wanted to show the world not only the loyalty of India's princes, but also the harmony of British power and Indian tradition. To him, the elephants were the perfect symbol. Ancient, powerful, respected, yet obedient, decorated not for war but for peace, walking in line before the representatives of the crown. Yet behind the grandeur, not all was as it seemed. Some princes bowed with heavy hearts. Though they smiled and waved, though they rode upon elephants dressed in gold, in their minds they remembered the days when their ancestors had ridden elephants into battle, when their howdahs had carried generals and kings who commanded their own destinies. Now they paraded before a foreign ruler, their pride wrapped in silks but their freedom clipped like the wings of a bird. For the common people too, there was a mixture of emotions. They were dazzled by the spectacle, yes, but they also whispered among themselves whose Durbar was this truly. Was it India's, or was it Britain's? The elephants, of course, knew none of this. They moved as they had been trained, their massive feet pressing into the soil, leaving prints that seemed like craters. They swung their trunks, trumpeted occasionally, and obeyed their mahouts with trust. For them, this was no act of loyalty to a foreign king, but simply the continuation of a bond that stretched back centuries. In India, elephants had always walked beside men, in temples, in forests, in palaces, in wars. This was simply another chapter. As the procession grew longer, the air filled with music. Bands played drums, trumpets, and flutes. British military tunes mixed with Indian melodies, creating a strange harmony that floated over the field. Flags of all colors waved in the breeze. The smell of incense and flowers mixed with the scent of dust and elephant hide. It was overwhelming to the senses, a dreamlike vision that would be remembered for generations. At the height of the Durbar, the elephants halted before the great dais, where the viceroy sat beneath a canopy of gold and silk. The nobles dismounted, their footsteps crunching upon carpets laid upon the earth. They approached the throne one by one, bowing, offering gifts, jewels, swords, gold coins, silks. Each gift was a token of loyalty, each bow a performance of submission. Behind them, the elephants stood still, their painted faces solemn, their eyes dark and deep as if watching everything silently. One elephant, massive and dark as the night, caught the crowd's attention. Upon its back sat a prince of Rajasthan, his robes blazing with orange and red. The elephant's tusks were capped with gold, its ears painted with the image of the rising sun. As it stood before the dais, it lifted its trunk high into the air and let out a loud trumpet that echoed across the field. For a moment, it was as though the jungle itself had spoken, reminding all present of the raw power that still resided in these animals. The crowd gasped, some cheered, others grew silent. Even Lord Curzon paused, his hand frozen in mid-gesture. But the mahout calmed the beast, whispering into its ear, and slowly the elephant lowered its trunk again, bowing its head. The moment passed, but it lingered in memory, a reminder that even beneath the paint and ornaments, these were still the untamed giants of India. The day stretched on, the sun moving slowly across the sky. The elephants continued their parade, the nobles gave their respects, and the Durbar unfolded like a great play upon the stage of Delhi. And yet, for many who watched, it was the elephants who remained the true stars. Kings and viceroys might come and go, But the image of 300 painted elephants bowing before a throne was something no man or woman would ever forget. When the final elephants passed and the Durbar drew to a close, the crowds began to disperse, their voices buzzing with excitement. Some spoke of the jewels they had seen, some of the grandeur of the princes, but most spoke of the elephants. Children imitated their walk, swinging their arms like trunks. Artists began sketching the designs they had seen painted upon their hides. Poets began to compose verses, comparing the elephants to living mountains that had bent their heads to the will of kings. As night fell, torches were lit again across the camps. The elephants were fed and bathed once more. The paint upon their bodies was smudged with sweat and dust, but still beautiful. They lay upon the ground, resting, while their mahouts sat nearby, cooking meals, telling stories, and laughing softly. Some mahouts prayed, thanking the gods for keeping their animals calm during the ceremony. Others simply leaned against the warm flanks of their elephants, listening to the slow rhythm of their breathing. In the silence of the night, away from the noise of the Durbar, one could reflect upon the deeper meaning of what had taken place. The elephants had bowed, yes, but had they really surrendered? Or were they simply being what they had always been? Companions to man, walking in step with his triumphs and his defeats. For centuries they had served kings and emperors, they had carried gods in temple processions, they had marched into war. Now they had paraded in honor of a foreign crown. But the elephants themselves remained unchanged, eternal, beyond politics, beyond empires. And perhaps that was the most surprising truth of all, that in a Durbar meant to display the power of men, it was the elephants who revealed the deeper story. Empires rise and fall, rulers come and go, but the bond between humans and animals, the respect for these giants, continues through the ages. The days following the Durbar were filled with talk. In every corner of Delhi, from the crowded bazaars to the marble halls of the palaces, people spoke of what they had seen. Some could not forget the shimmer of jewels worn by the princes, others spoke of the canopy of gold under which the viceroy had sat, but for most, the memory that lingered above all was that of the elephants. They had dominated the spectacle, not only by their size but by their majesty, their solemn dignity, and their painted beauty that had turned them into walking legends. Travelers who had come from faraway lands returned to their own countries with tales that seemed almost unbelievable. Writers described elephants covered in scarlet and gold, bearing rulers upon their backs, as though carrying living gods. Painters filled their canvases with images of living mountains decorated with colors of the rainbow. Photographers, with their heavy cameras, developed plates that captured the images of the Great Parade, and these pictures spread across newspapers and journals in Europe, America, and beyond. Readers in London, Paris, New York, and Berlin stared in wonder at the images, scarcely able to believe that such scenes belonged to the same world they inhabited. For the British Empire, the Durbar was a triumph. Newspapers in London praised the vision of Lord Curzon, describing the event as proof of India's loyalty and the grandeur of the Raj. Editorials proclaimed that no empire in history had ever staged a ceremony of such magnificence, with so many rulers, so many jewels, and, above all, so many elephants gathered in one place. They called it the greatest pageant of modern times, a vision that placed Britain not only as a ruler of India, but as a master of spectacle itself. Yet not all voices were filled with praise. Some writers in India, quietly and cautiously, spoke of the hollowness beneath the glitter. They pointed out that while princes displayed their treasures, the peasants in the countryside still struggled with poverty. While elephants marched in golden caparisons, many farmers labored in fields where the soil yielded little and hunger was common. To them, the Durbar was a mask, a grand performance meant to hide the realities of empire. But such voices were whispers, easily drowned by the roar of celebration. Among the Indian people themselves, the emotions were complex. Many felt pride in seeing their traditions displayed before the world. The elephants, painted with symbols of gods and kings, reminded them of their heritage, of an India that was ancient and vast. For a brief moment, even those who had little found themselves part of something immense, something that felt like history itself unfolding before their eyes. At the same time, some felt unease, For the Durbar was not truly their own. The elephants bowed not to an Indian emperor but to a foreign ruler. The grandeur was Indian, but the purpose was imperial. It was a strange mixture of pride and pain, beauty and submission. The elephants themselves returned to their camps outside the city. Their paint was washed away, their ornaments carefully removed, and their howdahs carried back to the storerooms of the princes. For the elephants, the Durbar was over. Just another day of following their mahouts, eating their meals of sugar cane and grass, bathing in the river and resting beneath the stars. They knew nothing of empire, of politics, of the meaning attached to their bows. Yet in the silence of their camps, they remained the silent carriers of history. Their bodies had borne the weight of princes and symbols. Their presence had given life to the spectacle, and though the paint faded, their memory endured. Visitors who had come from other lands continued to speak of them long after they returned home. Some compared the elephants to the armies of Alexander the Great, recalling how he too had faced Indian elephants when he crossed the Punjab centuries earlier. Others remembered the accounts of Mughal processions, where emperors had ridden upon elephants adorned in jewels, and they declared that the Durbar was a revival of those ancient glories. In coffee houses and salons across Europe, people argued whether such scenes belonged to the modern world or whether they were echoes of a vanished age. One thing was certain: the elephants had captured the imagination of the world. They were no longer just beasts of burden or animals of the jungle. They had become symbols of India's richness, its mystery, its power, and also its submission. For to the British, the elephants represented the empire itself, mighty, ancient, but now under control, disciplined, guided by the hand of the mahout who sat upon its neck. The image was powerful, and it was repeated again and again in speeches, writings, and illustrations. But beneath the surface, there were stories less told. Some mahouts spoke quietly of the difficulty of training the elephants for such parades. Not all animals were willing to endure the noise, the drums, the crowds, and the endless waiting in the sun. Some had grown restless, others nervous. It had taken months of patience, of feeding, of whispering, of guiding to prepare them. And there were fears too. What if one elephant had panicked in the crowd? What if one had charged? The spectacle that appeared so smooth had, in truth, been balanced upon the trust between man and beast, upon the centuries-old bond that kept the elephants calm amidst chaos. And then there was the matter of expense. The cost of painting, decorating, and housing so many elephants was immense. Some princes had spent fortunes upon their animals, adorning them with gold and silver, commissioning artisans to create patterns that would outshine their rivals. To these rulers, the elephant was not merely an animal, but a statement of their wealth, their status, their glory. Yet, when the Durbar was over, some quietly wondered whether the money could have been spent elsewhere, whether the grandeur of one day had been worth the price. Still, the memory of the Durbar endured. For years afterward, travelers to Delhi spoke of the elephants of 1903 as though they had been present at something mythical. Children who had seen the procession grew into adults who still remembered the sight of painted giants bowing before a throne. Writers of history would later describe it as one of the last great spectacles of empire, a moment when the old world and the new seemed to meet upon one field, and the elephants stood at the center of it all. And yet, as time passed, the elephants themselves faded from the grand stage. The world was changing. Automobiles began to appear upon the streets of Delhi. Trains carried goods and passengers across the land more swiftly than caravans. Machines and engines began to replace animals in the work of empire. The elephant, once the symbol of royal power and the companion of kings, began to retreat from the center of history, but in memory, in art, in story they remained. For those who had seen them at the Durbar, the vision of painted giants bowing to kings could never be erased. It was said that when the British guests returned to their homeland, they spoke less of the jewels and the princes, and more of the elephants. They told stories of how they moved like mountains across the field, how their paint shimmered like living tapestries, how their presence gave weight to the entire ceremony. To the Western imagination, the elephants became the very image of India itself. mysterious, ancient, magnificent. Thus, the Durbar of 1903 lived on not only in the records of empire, but in the minds of those who had witnessed it, and while men debated its meaning, whether it was a triumph of rule or a mask of submission, the elephants remained silent, as they had always been. They carried upon their backs the burdens of kings and the weight of history, but they themselves asked for nothing. In their dark eyes was a wisdom older than empire, older than kings, a patience that watched men rise and fall while they themselves endured. This section will continue in old, real, historical storytelling style. No intros, no welcome lines, just direct narration flowing like a history being retold. We'll focus on the legacy of the elephants after 1903, how the Durbar faded into memory, how India moved toward independence, and how the elephants stood as both living monuments and silent witnesses. As the years passed after the Durbar of 1903, Delhi itself changed. The city that had echoed with the footsteps of princes and the trumpeting of elephants during that grand spectacle grew restless with the currents of time. The echoes of the Durbar did not vanish at once, but slowly, like the fading of colors from old cloth, they slipped into memory. Yet the elephants remained in stories, in paintings, in photographs, and in the hearts of those who had stood in the sun and watched them bow before the throne. Children who had seen them became storytellers to their own children. They spoke of painted giants taller than rooftops, whose bodies shone with gold and red, whose ears flapped like banners in the wind, and who moved with a dignity unmatched by any human procession. To those who heard the tales, the elephants became almost mythical, creatures of wonder rather than living beasts of flesh and bone. The memory of their bows became a symbol of an age, of kings and empires, of splendor and power. Yet the world did not stand still. The empire that had staged that Durbar was itself changing. In London, governments rose and fell, and wars threatened the stability of nations. In India, movements stirred in the hearts of men and women who longed for freedom. The spectacle of loyalty that had been so carefully displayed in 1903 began to seem less certain as voices of dissent grew louder. The elephants had bowed before the empire, but the people of India would not bow forever. When the First World War erupted in 1914, the memory of the Durbar returned for a moment. Soldiers from India marched to distant lands, fighting for an empire that had shown its might upon the plains of Delhi. Some British writers recalled the elephants, writing that just as those giants had carried their kings with loyalty, so too would India carry the empire in war. But those were words written in comfort, far from the battlefields. For the men who fought in mud and trenches, the elephants were distant dreams, symbols of a grandeur that had no place amidst barbed wire and guns. In India, the elephants themselves continued their lives. Some remained in the service of princes, carrying their masters in ceremonies, hunting expeditions, and festivals. Others worked in the forests, hauling timber, clearing land, and laboring as they had for centuries. A few became legends, known by name, their stories whispered in villages, their presence remembered in festivals. But none were gathered again in such numbers as they had been in 1903. That Durbar remained unique, a moment when elephants had been called to stand as symbols of empire, never to be repeated in quite the same way. The decades passed, and with them came new struggles. The Second Great War shook the world, and India once again gave soldiers to battles far from its soil. But this time, the voices of freedom were louder, stronger, impossible to silence. The empire that had seemed eternal during the Durbar now trembled. Men spoke openly of independence, of a future where India would no longer bow. The elephants, still silent, stood as watchers of history. Some bore their riders in royal processions, but those processions now carried a different air, for everyone knew that the time of change was near. By the time 1947 arrived, the world that had staged the Durbar was gone. The empire had fractured, its power drained by wars and resistance. Independence came, and with it the end of the Raj. The princes who had once competed to outshine one another at the Durbar now faced the loss of their thrones, their kingdoms absorbed into a new nation. The jewels were locked away, the golden canopies removed, and the elephants that had once marched in glory were returned to quieter lives. Some elephants remained in royal stables for a time, used in weddings, in festivals, in processions that echoed faintly of the old days. But the meaning had changed. They were no longer symbols of empire, no longer made to bow before a foreign throne. Instead, they became symbols of tradition, of heritage, of India's own past. Tourists who came from abroad sought them out, wishing to see with their own eyes the creatures they had heard of in stories of the Durbar. Artists painted them, writers described them, and filmmakers captured their images. Yet the elephants themselves, patient and calm, seemed untouched by these changes. They had seen kings rise and fall, empires come and go, and still they walked the earth as they had always done. But the truth of their lives was not always as bright as the memory. Many elephants worked hard in forests, carrying heavy logs, straining their bodies in labor. Some were kept for festivals, their tusks capped with gold, their backs burdened with heavy howdahs, their skins painted with dyes. Others wandered in the wild, their herds shrinking as forests were cut down, their paths blocked by roads and towns. The elephants who had once stood at the center of history now faced new challenges, no less heavy than those they had borne beneath kings and princes. And yet, the memory of 1903 did not die. In books of history and museums, in photographs preserved on fragile paper, the image of elephants bowing before a throne remained. For some, it was a symbol of the power of empire. For others, it was a reminder of India's grandeur, of its capacity to create beauty unmatched in any other land. The debate continued, but the elephants remained beyond it, creatures of silence, their story told by others, but their wisdom unspoken. Even today, more than a century after that day, the elephants of the Delhi Durbar are remembered. Their images appear in exhibitions, their names in the pages of books, their forms in faded photographs that still astonish viewers. People look at those pictures and wonder what must it have been like to stand there, to hear the drums, to see the princes, and to watch as painted giants bowed before a throne of gold. For those who were there, the answer was simple. It was a vision never to be forgotten. And for those of us who only know it through memory, it remains a story that carries the weight of history. The elephants walked, they bowed, and in their silence they bore witness to the turning of an age. They were not kings, not rulers, not emperors. But without them, the Durbar would have been only half the spectacle it became. It was they, the giants of India, who gave it its soul. And thus the elephants, who neither spoke nor judged, became the keepers of memory. They reminded the world of India's greatness, of its beauty, of its ancient traditions. They reminded the empire that it ruled over something vast, mysterious, and powerful. And in time, when the empire itself was gone, the elephants remained as reminders that history is larger than any throne, any crown, any empire. The elephants of Delhi Durbar lived their lives and passed into memory, but their story endures. For as long as men tell tales of kings and empires, their bows before the throne of 1903 will be remembered, a moment when giants carried the weight of history upon their backs and then walked away into silence. The memory of that Durbar, held in the winter sun of 1903, did not simply vanish into dust with the passing of time. It became a thread woven into the vast fabric of India's history, a tapestry where kings and emperors, princes and soldiers, peasants and poets, and yes, even elephants, were given their place. Those who were there remembered, and those who came later heard the tale retold again and again, until it became more than just an event. It became a symbol. But what does a symbol mean? For some, it was proof of the empire's power, its ability to command loyalty, to gather rulers from every corner of India, to organize a spectacle so vast that the world could scarcely believe it. For others, it was a picture of India's magnificence, of its deep traditions, its ability to create beauty, its elephants dressed in silks and gold moving like living mountains. And for still others, it was a reminder of bondage, of an empire that demanded bows from not only men, but from beasts who carried centuries of silent wisdom. The truth, perhaps, lies in all these things at once. For history is never one story. It is many stories layered upon each other, like the skins of the elephants themselves, thick and strong, yet bearing the marks of every year, every season, every burden carried. As decades rolled forward, the Durbar became a photograph in an album, a line in a history book, a fading painting in a palace. But the elephants lived on, long after the soldiers had marched away, long after the princes had lost their thrones, long after the empire itself had broken apart. They remained in the forests of Assam, in the temples of Kerala, in the festivals of Jaipur, in the quiet corners of zoos and sanctuaries. They remained, walking slowly, carrying with them a memory of that day. Some of those very elephants that bowed in 1903 lived to see India free. Their eyes, small and deep and wise, witnessed the changing of flags, the speeches of leaders, the cries of celebration, the breaking apart of nations, and the birth of new ones. They did not cheer, they did not weep, they did not speak. But they were there, as silent witnesses. Just as they had stood in the sun for the Durbar, so too did they stand beneath the skies of independence, unmoved by human crowns, loyal only to the rhythm of the earth. And here lies the great truth: the elephants were never truly subjects of empire, nor servants of kings. They walked beside humans, carrying their loads, pulling their timber, marching in their armies, standing in their festivals. But in their hearts they belonged to no one. They belonged to the forests, to the rivers, to the winds that blew through the grasslands. They belonged to time itself. The empire came and went, the kings rose and fell. But the elephants remained, as they had remained for thousands of years, as they will remain so long as the forests endure. When we look back upon the Delhi Durbar, when we see those painted giants bowing before a golden throne, it is tempting to think of it as the height of glory, the triumph of empire, the celebration of kingship. Yet perhaps it was something else as well. Perhaps it was also a reminder, silent, powerful, unspoken, that no matter how high a throne is built, no matter how bright the jewels upon a crown, there are forces older, larger, and stronger than any human power. The elephants bowed, yes, but their bow was not one of surrender. It was a gesture written by men, commanded by kings, but understood only by those who watched closely. For when the bow was over, the elephants rose again, and in their rising, they reminded the world that no empire lasts forever. The elephants walked away from that day, carrying their mahouts, carrying their memories, carrying their silence. And in that silence was wisdom. Wisdom that empires crumble, that kings pass into dust, that time washes all splendor away. Wisdom that the earth endures, that forests grow again, that rivers carve their paths through stone. Wisdom that life continues, with or without thrones and crowns. Even now, more than a century later, we stand in awe of their memory. We see the faded photographs, the painted scenes, the grainy footage, and our hearts stir. We imagine the sound of drums, the glitter of jewels, the vast crowds pressing together, and in the center of it all, the giants of the earth bowing before kings. And yet, as we imagine it, we cannot help but feel the deeper truth that the elephants were greater than the throne itself. For the throne is gone. The empire is gone. The jewels are locked away. The princes are forgotten. But the elephants remain in our stories, in our imaginations, in the forests of India where they still walk beneath the shade of trees. So let us remember them not only as creatures of spectacle, painted and adorned, made to bow for the pleasure of kings. Let us remember them as they truly were, ancient, wise, patient, and strong. Let us remember that when the crowns have fallen and the empires have ended, it is the silent ones, the watchers, the giants of the earth, who carry history upon their backs. The Delhi Durbar of 1903 is gone, but the elephants who graced it live forever in story. Their trunks lifted, their ears flapping, their steps heavy yet graceful, they remain eternal. And so long as men tell tales of kings and empires, of crowns and thrones, of glory and power, so too will the elephants of Delhi Durbar be remembered. Giants who bowed once, and then rose, and in rising taught us that no empire lasts but life endures.